Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, brothers, sisters. As director of the Las Casas Institute, it's a great pleasure to welcome all of you here this evening for this annual lecture and to congratulate you on finding your way through the maze. As you may know, the Institute takes its inspiration from Bartolomé de las Casas, the 16th century Dominican friar who championed the rights of indigenous peoples of the Americas. The Institute seeks to bring the intellectual tradition, Catholic and wider, to bear on pressing issues of social justice, one of which is, of course, what we owe to present and future generations in managing, conserving, exploiting, or not, the world around us, and hence our speaker this evening. Isabella Tree is an award-winning author, travel writer and conservationist, senior travel correspondent at the Evening Standard from 1993 to 95. Her 96 book, Islands in the Clouds, travels in the highlands of New Guinea, won considerable acclaim and was shortlisted for the Thomas Cook Travel Book Award. However, her writings have, of course, not been limited to that genre, nor to the distant and exotic. Her first book, The Birdman, concerned the Victorian ornithologist John Gould. And last year, she published what I think is a truly wonderful book, Wilding, the story of how she and her husband, Charlie Burrell, have allowed nature to transform their estate at Knepp Castle. The book is at times hilarious. My favourite passage concerns the adventures of some Tamworth pigs and a bag of Mr. Whippy concentrate. But it's also a deeply moving account as it details the beauty and biodiversity that returns to the land in the absence of over-farming. The book has indeed a very serious message about the degradation or restoration of nature, about the soil beneath our feet, and the impact on our future through the plants, insects, birds, and animals that form a single interdependent ecology. Isabella has very kindly agreed to speak this evening about the Knepp Wildland Project, to present some visual materials that show us its transforming effects, and to answer questions we may have afterwards. It's a delight to welcome you here this evening. Thank you so much for coming. Thank you and welcome.
Thank you very much indeed. A very over-generous introduction. But I wanted to start with a slightly somber note. I think we're probably all quite somber these days. But we wake up, it seems, every day to more and more reports about the catastrophes that we are causing the planet as human beings. The UN recently announced that we are in danger of losing 1 million species. That's 1 million species going extinct on our planet because of us. We have 5 trillion pieces of plastic floating there out in the oceans thanks to us. And recently the RSPB announced that we had 44 million fewer birds in our skies today than we did in the 1960s. The American biologist E.O. Wilson, in one of his most recent books, Half Earth, said that if we are to recover biodiversity, if we are to stabilise and perhaps even return some of the natural processes, the ecosystems on which species, including our own, survive, then we have to dedicate half Earth to nature. We have to give back half of the planet to nature. A hugely generous and enormous step. And that means not just nature in wilderness areas and national parks, it means welcoming it back into our own backyards. So the question is, how do we do this? How do we go about this? Well, Knepp, our little project, is, I mean, it's a pimple on the back of an elephant compared to the sort of global situation. But I think it's a way, it just shows a way that we can do it. It's been astonishingly effective in a very short amount of time. And what we've discovered is it addresses not just the issue of biodiversity, but also so many of the other problems facing our planet today. And above all, it's a story of hope, which is, I think, something we all need right now. So this is where we are, in the southeast corner of England, a few miles south of Horsham, about 44 miles south of London, underneath the Gatwick stacking system, surrounded by A roads and the kind of, you know, I'm sure you feel busy and congested here, but we really do in this corner. And this is where my husband and I inherited an estate in the 1980s from Charlie's grandparents. This is the house. It's called Knepp Castle. It was built for my husband's family about 220 years ago by the architect John Nash. It sits in the middle of 3,500 acres. And when we inherited it, it was all an intensive arable and dairy farm. And we fully expected to carry on that way. But the important thing, I think, to remember is that it wasn't always an intensive arable and dairy farm. In fact, it had been transformed enormously in the Second World War. We all remember what happened in the Dig for Victory campaign, of course. We were isolated as a nation, facing starvation, our supply lines were cut, and the government incentivized landowners and farmers to plough up every available inch of land for the war effort in order to feed ourselves. So we lost commons, we ploughed up cricket pitches, we even ploughed up the South Downs, which had been sacrosanct during the First World War. Every little inch was made available for the war effort. And you can see here, this is Knepp and the Repton Park around the house, which had probably never been ploughed ever in history, is growing its first fine wheat crop. You can see in the bottom left-hand corner in Charlie's grandmother's handwriting. And in the back, you've got the Duke of Gloucester reviewing the Canadian Army who was stationed at Knepp during the war. So what happened in the Dig for Victory campaign, I think, is something that we tend to have kind of amalgamated into an idea of progress. What it was a situation of crisis. And we were doing our utmost to feed ourselves in a moment of crisis. When that crisis passed, a lot of agronomists, the top agronomists in the UK, were begging the government to return to the old system of rotational farming, to allow the land to recover between ploughing, between crops. Because what they were seeing in just even the few years of that continuous ploughing and continuous cropping was a severe degradation of our soils. And this has become something that is really critically endangering the planet today. But what happened after the Dig for Victory campaign, unfortunately, was we, like the rest of the world, became addicted to this new invention of chemicals, the idea of chemical farming. It seemed to be the solution to be able to feed ourselves ad infinitum. And so, like Europe and the rest of the world, Russia and the States, we started embarking on intensive agriculture, ploughing every single year, not bothering to rotate, allow the soil to rest. And we're beginning to see the results of that system. We know now, according to some scientists, that our soils are so depleted that we have 100 harvests left across the planet before we have no topsoil in which to grow anything. Whether you agree with that particular synopsis, that was a UN report, we certainly have degrading soils to such an extent that in places like the Fens, for example, we may only have 15 years of harvest left. So it's a really critical problem, this issue of soil degradation. And of course, like the rest of the world, we began producing phenomenal, thanks to these chemical fertilizers, in phenomenal amounts of crops. In fact, we're overproducing. And this is something that I think is a sort of generally the elephant in the room when we're talking about conservation and food security. It's something that the food and farming industry do not want us to know about. We are currently producing enough food on this planet for 11 billion people, and we're 7.5 billion now. We're wasting 40% of that food. So I've just come back with my husband from America, and we were driving up the west coast of the States and the Pacific coast, and we were driving through California. We drove through mile upon mile of red peppers that were not going to be picked this season because a few of them had blight on them. They were perfectly edible, but they were just not worth picking, and they were just going to be left on the plants. Again, we drove through mile upon mile of grapefruit orchards and orange groves, not being picked because the commodity price had fallen, and so it wasn't worth picking them. We started producing after the Second World War so much grain that we had to think, the farming and food industry had to think of ways of finding extra mouths to feed this grain to. So that's when we started feeding grain to cattle, and then dairy, beef animals first, then dairy animals, and even, God forbid, sheep. And now we're still trying to find mouths for our food to fill in the shape of cars. So we're looking at biofuels and how can we actually feed maize to our cars. This is all part of a system of overproduction. So it's really important, I think, to keep this in mind when we're thinking about conservation for the future. So this is what most of lowland Britain looks like, and every inch is ploughed up. We've come to accept this as normal. We've come to accept this idea of maximum production as something that we need to be doing. And it's not surprising when you look at this picture to think that biodiversity has gone like this. We pulled up 75,000 miles of hedges since the Second World War. We've lost 97% of our wildflower meadows. Almost all our lowland heathland is gone, almost all our lowland wetland. So we've completely transformed our landscape, not just since the Industrial Revolution, which was a big enough impact, but certainly since the Second World War, and then since the 70s and 80s with this huge industrialisation. But when we took on Knepp, and this is what it looked like 20 years ago, we thought this was a perfectly acceptable scene, and we fully expected to be carrying on ploughing and keeping it looking like this. What we hadn't realised when we took over was that the farm was, and this was in the 1980s, was already losing money hand over fist. I think we assumed with a sort of arrogance, perhaps, of youth, that it was all down to Charlie's grandparents, and we levelled the blame at them. We thought that they hadn't been investing in infrastructure, they didn't know the latest technologies, so of course it was losing money. But Charlie was fresh out of Cirencester Agricultural College, a child of the Green Revolution, a misnomer if ever there was one, but he felt very much that he could turn this business around, that he knew the latest science and could make a go of it. So we did what every good farmer is supposed to do. We invested in bigger machinery, we experimented with different varieties of crops, we amalgamated 6 dairies into 3 dairies, we put in state-of-the-art milking parlours that looked like something out of NASA, we invested in infrastructure, we changed our old red pole herd, prize-winning red pole ancient breed for modern Holstein and Friesians that would milk better. We even experimented and tried to diversify into Charlie Burrell's Castle Dairy ice cream, which was poised to go national until Haagen-Dazs, the Darth Vader of ice cream producers, came in and came over to Europe and blew us out of the galaxy. But everything we did, even after 17 years of trying everything, we were still losing money. If anything, the prospect of making profits ever was farther than it had ever been before. We were £1.5 million in debt, and we knew we couldn't go on. The problem, as always, is this. It's the low-wheeled Sussex clay. I don't know if any of you are familiar with this stuff, but I think the Inuit are supposed to have dozens and dozens of different words for different types of snow. In the old Sussex dialect, we have 35 words for mud. That's how much it governs our lives. So in a hot summer, you can literally put your hand down cracks in the ground up to your shoulder. And in the winter, like a wet winter like we're beginning to have now, it turns into porridge, unfathomable porridge. We sit on 320 metres of this stuff. And so sometimes you can't get heavy machinery onto your land for 6 months of the year. That means you can't sow spring crops, you can't do any maintenance, you can't clear your ditches. You simply can't compete. You can't compete with lovely loamy soils over in Chichester and places like that where we daren't even look. So we realised that finally, after 17 years, it took us a long time to cotton on, that our land was simply, our marginal land was not suited to modern intensive farming. We had to do something different. And we wanted to do something that was going to work with the land rather than fight against it all the time. Selling up wasn't an option for us because we felt it had been in the family for more than two centuries. We kind of considered ourselves sort of to be stewards. It wasn't really us to sell on. But we had to find something that was going to make it sustainable and that was going to work into the future. And I don't know if any of you have ever been in the unfortunate position of being in a failing business, but when you are, it's very, very difficult to think creatively, to think expansively. And I think that's a position that a lot of farmers are in at the moment. You are looking so hard for every little upturn that you just are totally blinkered. You're a rabbit in the headlights. You can't think objectively. But it's when you finally say, enough is enough, this is the end, we are calling an end to farming, that is when you're suddenly free and you can actually start to stand back and look at your land more objectively, what you should and could be doing with it. And it was in that frame of mind that we met this amazing man, Frans Vera. He's a Dutch ecologist. He's on the right here with the grey hair. And his book, Grazing, Ecology and Forest History, was published in English in the very same year that we sold our farm machinery. We sold our beautiful 3 dairy herds. They were 3 of the top 10 dairy herds consistently in the country, so we weren't bad farmers. We sold the dairy herds and the machinery and our milk quota, and we managed to clear our debts. And it was in that kind of frame of mind that we met Frans Vera, and his book, Grazing, Ecology and Forest History, was published that very same year in English. And what he was saying really excited us because it seemed to show a solution or something that we could try, experiment with on our land. What Frans is saying is that in all our imaginings of how temperate zone Europe looked before human impact, we've completely forgotten about the free-roaming animals, the megafauna that would have been here. We've forgotten about aurochs, tarpan, bison, elk, wild boar, red deer, but beavers by the million. And what these animals would have been doing in numbers that we can hardly even begin to imagine today, they would have been driving the system, creating habitats, disturbing the land, opening it up. It would have been a much more biodiverse, more kaleidoscopic, dynamic landscape than the kind of closed canopy forest idea we often have in our heads. You know, that sort of Hansel and Gretel myth we have where a squirrel could have run from John O'Groats to Land's End without touching the ground. And in many ways, it would have looked much more open and much more like the Serengeti. And this is, I think, what naturalists and ecologists are coming around to thinking now. Even the palynologists are beginning to agree that there would have been a far more open landscape than we've previously thought before. And the drivers of this system would have been, in huge part, the megafauna. So what Frans Vera is saying is that if you want to recover biodiversity, the way to do this is to put back these drivers into the system, put back the megafauna, allow them free range to operate, allow them to manage the system, and then extraordinary things will happen. They are the kind of, the sort of impetus that pulls that glider back into the sky so it can fly. So we thought, well, this is a really interesting experiment. If we could put free-roaming animals back onto our severely depleted, chemically abused agricultural land underneath the Gatwick stacking system in southeast England and increase biodiversity just a little bit, that would be an experiment worth trying. And so we had a fantastic time, or Charlie, my husband, did, for that first summer after he made this decision of smashing up all those Victorian drains that had been trying so ineffectually to get the water off our land, just allowing the water to sit on our clay where it had always wanted to sit. And immediately we started seeing extraordinary things happening, wildfowl coming in, water plants almost instantly started appearing. And the first summer, that sound of insects was just overwhelming. We suddenly realised as farmers we hadn't even known we'd been missing it. But the insect sound was astonishing. And of course, with the insects comes birds. And when the arable fields were just left fallow after their last harvest, up popped thorny scrub, blackthorn, hawthorn, bramble, dog rose. And then planted in amongst that thorny scrub, jays started planting acorns, and up, protected from rabbits and from roe deer, up came your first generation of new oaks, something to replace the generation that Repton Park had been seeded with hundreds and hundreds of years ago. So we knew something exciting was going to happen. We took up about 70 miles of internal fences. We took up barbed wire, gate posts. We let the ditches just silt up. Imagine the relief for a farmer of just letting that infrastructure go, and the cost, saving that cost. And finally, after about 7 or 8 years, we managed to persuade the powers that be that we weren't completely off our trolley, that there was kind of method in our madness, and the signs were propitious enough to allow us to, we got higher level stewardship funding to eventually fence the entire estate, deer fence it, so that we could introduce our free roaming animals. Now, because we've hunted to extinction most of our megafauna, or many species of them, we've lost the aurochs, we've lost the tarpan, we jolly nearly hunted to extinction the bison. We lost several subspecies of bison in Europe. We have now got bison back from the brink, and they're proving to be an amazing keystone species in rewilding projects, huge rewilding projects in Europe. But we don't have them in Britain. We lost our beavers and hunted them to extinction hundreds of years ago. They are thankfully coming back, and we have just applied for our license. We wait to hear where we're going to be allowed to release beavers on Knepp. But so what we can do, though, is we can use animals as proxies, as it were, of some of these extinct or missing species. And so instead of the tarpan, this is the tarpan on a cave painting in Lascaux in France, 17,500 years ago, we have introduced our proxy for the tarpan, an old English Longhorn doing a very good job of imitating its ancestor. And what's so astonishing is how these animals start behaving in a landscape like this. Obviously, cows don't just eat grass. Originally, like the aurochs, they would have been browsers as well as grazers. Hugely important, this, because their impact on vegetation is huge. And these animals can carry up to 230 different seed species in their gut, their hooves and their fur. So they're a very important vector of flora around a landscape, eating in one place, moving sometimes miles, and dunging out those seeds in a perfect pile of manure ready to take off again. And of course, they're not just transporting seeds, they're also transporting minerals and nutrients too. So a very dynamic process, again, that we've forgotten about in our very static systems of farming today. And you can see, I think, some bulls being particularly disturbing influences on the soil when they're forming up to each other. And then we have Exmoor ponies standing in for the tarpan. That's the tarpan at the top. Look how similar they are. Amazing similarities. And the Exmoor is one of our oldest breeds of horse. It was almost lost. I think it was down to about 40 or so individuals on Exmoor itself. I'm ashamed to say largely because the British Army used it as target practice during the war. But it is coming back as a species. It's still rarer than the tiger. But we have a large herd of free-roaming wild Exmoor at Knepp. And what they're doing, again, is that disturbance, creating vegetation complexity by doing different things with their behaviours and what they choose to eat. And I think what's so interesting, particularly about the ponies, is their relationship with the cattle. It's something we've completely forgotten about, I think, in our modern sort of mind. Princeton University are doing a really interesting experiment on this in Kenya. And what they've found, I love it because it's so counterintuitive. It's just like, so much of rewilding. What they've found is that if you have 100 head of cattle grazing a given area, and you allow them to graze with an equine, and that could be a pony, a donkey, it could even be a zebra, those 100 head of cattle will put on more condition than if they're allowed to graze the same area on their own. So how could that be? Well, what's happening is the horses are taking out all the rough stuff. Here they're eating thistles, but all that thick, thatchy, dry grass that the cattle just can't stomach. And if you have horses getting rid of all that, that enables the sweeter grasses to come through that then benefits the cattle. So I have this kind of image in my head of thousands of years ago, we would have had herds of tarpan moving through the landscape, and in their wake would have been herds of aurochs coming up behind them in the habitat that the tarpan had created for them. And then we've got 3 different types of deer. We had roe deer in small numbers, but we've added fallow and red deer. Again, the same sort of idea, different methods of disturbance, different mouthpieces in the landscape, all adding to that complexity, all adding to that kaleidoscopic creation of habitat and the domino effect that you have for other species. So we've just finished, the rut has just finished at Knepp recently, and so the air has just been full of testosterone and pheromones, and the stench has been unbelievable with clashing antlers all through the night. And that's one of the most disturbing times of the year because, of course, the red stags are turfing up the ground with their antlers, the fallow are creating lecks where they urinate all over the place, and these gladiatorial arenas, and they're rubbing their scent glands on posts and trees and branches, and every little thing they do has a knock-on effect for other wildlife. And then my favourite, the Tamworth pig standing in for the wild boar. Don't ask me, it's a really strange anomaly, but wild boar are covered by the Dangerous Wild Animals Act, which was really intended for people keeping pythons in the 1970s. But anyway, then we are not allowed to introduce wild boar onto your land, and so until they arrive, and hopefully they'll find us from East Sussex, and they'll push down that deer fence. They won't have a problem pushing that down, enticed by our wonderful Tamworth sows, and we'll have wild boar at Knepp. But until then, the wild boar are doing an incredibly good job of imitating, the Tamworths rather, are doing a very good job of imitating wild boar. And one of the things I think that's astonishing is when you see domesticated animals released into a landscape like this, who would think that a pig could behave like a hippo? They're full of surprises. These pigs can hold their breath for 20 seconds. They can swim, they can dive. They're diving for swan mussels at the bottom of the lake. They'll pull up the swan mussels and pull them to the side of the bank and open them with their trotters and take their flesh out very delicately. They're astonishing creatures. And what it makes me feel about this is that, when we were farming, I used to look at our dairy cows, with their heads down in a green field, and I thought they were perfectly lovely animals, but a bit boring, to be honest. But of course, it's not the animal that's boring, it's the situation we're putting them in. Release them into a landscape like this where they can give full vent to their kind of curiosity, their intelligence, their whole personality kind of explodes. And suddenly you're also seeing their instincts, they're still there. They know what to eat, they know how to self-medicate. It's amazing to see these behaviours coming back. And of course, one of the things that the pigs are doing for us is rootling, a sort of disturbance that's hugely important for plants. So you can imagine that thick, thatchy sward is very difficult for many plants, for seeds to penetrate, to germinate, but give a little bit of opening, a little bit of rootling in there, and suddenly you see a much more complex sward come back, that you can see how much more complex it is already from just that little patch of rootling. And that's why we think, because of the pig rootling, that we're finding so many of our native wildflowers coming back at Knepp. I am training myself, I have to say it in this way, because I'm never going to use the word weed again. These are our native wildflowers, and they are so beautiful. And plant life has a lot to say about this. We have zero tolerance for them in our landscape, not just in our arable landscape where we're hugely efficient at getting rid of them, but on our roadside verges and in our gardens. But they are absolutely lovely. And of course, so many creatures depend on them, including pollinators, but also birds. So when we have plants like this coming back, like bird's foot trefoil, we've got scarlet pimpernel, we've got red clover, fumetry for the first time at Knepp. We've never had a record of fumetry. We had that last year. Fluellen, lots of vetches and vetchlings, black medic. They all have these tiny little protein-rich seeds which are hugely important, particularly for birds. So you can imagine if we're losing these flowers from our landscape, we're also losing all the other species that depend on them. So this is what's happened at Knepp. This is Knepp if you were flying over as a bird 20 years ago. You can see it doesn't look hugely enticing. And this is what's happened as the land begins to heal itself, as it progressively becomes kind of wilder and wilder. And I think you can see there, it's sort of beginning to look more like Africa, more like the African scrub. And you can actually begin to see kind of animal trails kind of making their way through that scrub. And this is what it looks like from the ground. Again, one of the most diverse habitats there is, and yet it's something that we consider completely worthless, scrubland. Most people, particularly farmers, would look at that picture and call it wasteland and send in huge machines to take out all that scrub, and it would be taken out in hours. Even in conservation areas, we have volunteers going in at weekends, scrub bashing, taking this stuff out. And yet it's one of the most biodiverse habitats we have. Our landscape would have been full of it in medieval times. And most of our field names, if you look back to them, especially places like Knepp, relate to scrub. Because it had value in the old days. We got gunpowder from it. We got everything from medicine to handles, tool handles, to thatch, to things that we ate, to dyes. Everything we needed came from this. And I have a kind of maybe pipe dream that, you know, in the post-plastic age, we might start finding uses for this again. But in the meantime, it is fantastic for biodiversity. And so this is where we're finding not just insects and wildflowers, but we're finding small mammals and we're finding birds. This is where they nest. They're in that thorny scrub. They can nest safe from predation. So you can walk out on a May day, on a spring morning, and the sound of birds is so riotous that you can literally feel it reverberating in your stomach. We're changing the baseline that most ecologists think you cannot fit any more birds into that landscape, and still they keep on coming. So it's been completely astonishing. The key, of course, is the free-roaming animals, but you don't want to have too many of them or they will overgraze and they will actually get rid of that scrub. Equally, you don't want to have too few because then that scrub will mature, it will come up, you'll have saplings being very successful in amongst that thorny scrub, and you'll eventually get closed canopy woodland. And again, that's a habitat that is very species poor, comparatively speaking, and it's also very static. So what you want is this endless battle between vegetation succession and animal disturbance. You don't want either side to win, but you want just enough animals to make it difficult for that scrub to encroach anymore, either percentage-wise, but you can have it shifting, you can have it moving, and that's what's happening at Knepp. It's very dynamic, and these two forces are endlessly battling it out together. And that's when you get all the messy margins, the kind of the subtleties of habitat, which benefit species, particularly if you have insects and some birds that have a complicated life cycle where they need actually several different habitats to thrive. And thanks to this, particularly to this scrub, but to this dynamism really, we're beginning to see species not just in terms of biomass, but really rare species coming back to Knepp. So, I mean, if I put up all the red data species that we have at Knepp now, you wouldn't be able to recognise them because they'd be so small, there's so many of them. But we have, just for example, we have ravens back at Knepp for the first time in 100 years. We have lesser spotted woodpecker. We have cuckoos. We tagged 3 cuckoos last summer, and all 3 of them came back from the sub-Saharan Africa to Knepp. We've got woodcock, we've got snipe, we've got nightingales. We're one of the few places in Britain now where the concentration of nightingales is so great that you can literally hear 2, 3, 4, sometimes even 5 nightingales singing, competing with each other at night. I think the only place that has a denser concentration of nightingales is Lodge Hill, ex-MOD land in Kent, which has now been zoned for housing. We also have turtle doves, and this is probably, to me, the most poignant of all. Turtle doves, according to the RSPB, are the species most likely to go extinct from our landscape, from our country, in the next 10 to 15 years. About 7 years ago, we started hearing turtle doves at Knepp. This was a total surprise. We have no record of them being at Knepp since the BTO have been doing surveys at Knepp, and suddenly we were hearing them. Last year, we had 20 singing males. We know that they're breeding because we've seen the fledglings. We've even been able to ring a few. According to Matthew Oates, who was until recently the nature specialist at the National Trust, we probably have more turtle doves on 3,500 acres of Knepp than the National Trust does on 250,000 hectares. So it's been astonishing what's happened. And we have all 5 species of owl, including the little owl on the left, which is burgeoning. It's a beetle specialist. And so because we're now not putting avermectins or wormers into the cows, we're not feeding them antibiotics, that dung is organic. And that is attracting dung beetles. And that is why the little owl is just proliferating at Knepp. My husband has also turned into a bit of a dung beetle fetishist. And I couldn't understand what he was doing. Last summer, I was watching him and he was following the cattle around with his mobile phone. And every time one of them did a cow pat, he would drop to his stomach next to the cow pat with his mobile phone. And I couldn't understand what he was doing. But he was timing how long it took the dung beetles to find the cow pat. And the record was under 60 seconds. That was all fine until he sort of brought his experiments into the kitchen, and he started doing kind of cow pat experiments on the kitchen table, and there were unspeakable things in the freezer for a summer. But what he did discover by the end of that summer, 23 species of dung beetle in one single cow pat. Astonishing, including one dung beetle, the violet door beetle, which hasn't been seen in Sussex for 50 years. So how they find us, we haven't introduced any of these species, they've just found us because the habitat and the resources are there. So they must be clinging on to little tiny patches somewhere. And of course, as soon as they find Knepp, then they just go bang. So it's been incredibly exciting. We've got 13 out of the UK's 17 species of bat, including this one, Beckstein's bat, which is so rare we don't know much about it at all. It's rare even in Europe. And we're now by far the biggest breeding hotspot for purple emperor butterflies. I'm ashamed to say I didn't even know we had a purple emperor butterfly until they started breeding at Knepp, but it's our second largest butterfly. It's almost like an honorary bird. There's no sort of flapping around and sipping on wildflowers. This likes foxcat. It behaves like, it's very territorial, it's very aggressive, it will chase blue tits. You can throw a stick up into the sky, it'll try and chase that. It's astonishing. It behaves like a tropical butterfly, very uncharacteristically, very un-British, but it's a wonderful butterfly. So the question really, I think, is how does rewilding fit into this picture of our landscape? Well, this is, I think, how most people would describe our green and pleasant land, our picture postcard idea of what England looks like and perhaps should look like. But it's not until you look more closely that you realise that this is virtually a biological desert. We've got canalised rivers, we've got roads chopping it up, we've got monoculture crops, we've got a town up there which is completely separate, surrounded by monoculture crops. It has absolutely no space for nature in there at all. These tiny little patches of ancient woodland, if that's what they are, that's a plantation down there, are isolated and unconnected, so very difficult for species in there to be resilient. How do we go about getting this landscape wilder? And of course, we have to always think we've got to have space to grow food. We're not going to be ignoring agriculture entirely here. What we're talking about is how we can amalgamate rewilding into our agricultural landscapes. This is how I think it works. So imagine that's our Knepp, that's our kind of biodiversity. Oh, I've got one of these, haven't I? A biodiversity hotspot where you've recovered nature, you've recovered your natural processes, things are beginning to kick off, you've got fantastic species coming back, longing to spread out into the landscape, but they're not going to find anywhere to proliferate out there. So what you need to do instantly is put in some wildlife corridors. So you start to join up your areas of nature together so that they can actually be, populations can be resilient and they can move, hugely important in the face of climate change and rising temperatures. Of course, you can't allow the roads just to carry on chopping through those wildlife corridors. You've got to create land bridges. We are rubbish at this. I think we have 1.5, and I can't quite understand why we have a half, maybe we haven't finished it yet, land bridges in Britain. We've been returning every year of the last 5 years or so, we've been returning thousands of euros to Europe that were intended for this kind of project to connect nature areas together, because no one's come forward with projects of how to do it or where to do it. In Holland, they have hundreds of road bridges. They're really good at connecting nature together. We've got to start thinking about how we connect up landscapes and connect nature in our landscapes. And then, of course, we can use our hedges as wildlife corridors. They always were wildlife corridors, but we can be generous with our hedges. We know at Knepp now from our studies on nightingales that all you have to do in a nightingale area is double the width of your hedge to 6 metres, and you'll get nightingales back. So it's very, very simple. And it'd be a very effective way of increasing that wildlife corridor aspect in our landscapes. And then, of course, we've got to have areas of nature, high florific value around even our intensive cropped areas, because we know that if you sacrifice that little strip around your arable fields, even in a conventional chemical system, your yield goes up. And that's because it looks like something like this. And that's because you're increasing not just your pollinating insects, but also increasing your predatory insects and your birds that help control the pests in your crops. So you need less pesticide, but you also get higher crop yields. So even conventional farmers understand this, and we have to start getting back to adding nature around our fields. But of course, we can't go on with business as usual in agriculture. We know that our soils are eroding. We know the dangers of the whole chemical system. We have to start moving into regenerative agriculture, and that means no ploughing. The plough was the worst invention that man has ever come up with, and we kept inventing it over and over again, and civilizations kept on crashing because we abused our soils, and we're still doing it. We have to turn to regenerative agriculture, and that means no plough, cover crops and rotational cropping, so you're always one step ahead of the pesticides. Luckily, there are already amazing pioneering farmers in this field who are proving how fantastic this is and the potential for this. I haven't got time to go into all of these, but if I was going to pick two, say, I would go for Growing a Revolution, David Montgomery, absolutely astonishing breadth of knowledge and how this whole mindset is changing amongst farmers at grassroots level in America, and Gabe Brown, whose book Dirt to Soil has just been absolutely, to coin a phrase, seminal, because what he's shown, he's a North Dakota farmer, he is now in the top 15% of producers in North Dakota, with no inputs whatsoever. He's not even irrigating his crops in the summer like all his neighbours have to do. And in the winter, his soils are 6 degrees warmer than his neighbours, which means that because his soils are restored, there's actual life in the soil, and that makes them much, much warmer. So he's doubled his soil growing season. So the impact of that is that not only has Gabe Brown got 4 months off a year instead of having to farm, all year round, he actually is benefiting from profits for the first time because he has no inputs, and he's also passing those profits on to the consumer at the farm gate because their food is cheaper because he hasn't had to pay so much for it. And of course that food is much more nutritious because he has restored his soils. It's a win-win-win-win situation. The problem is, how do you break the paradigm of the big farming industry to get this available everywhere? But it is happening, and it's happening particularly in Australia and America, where they are really suffering from soil loss and water loss. And then, of course, we can do agroforestry, another type of sort of silver pasture, very effective at restoring your soils, growing your soils again, and producing food, as well as fantastic trees and vegetation, and fantastic for biodiversity. And also, we've got to do something about our water systems and rewild some of our river systems and start regenerating our wetlands, because we have to start thinking of ways that we can mitigate against floods. We've been seeing how desperate it is when you have flooding downstream and you have the cost to urban structures, to land, to the whole system downstream when you have these big floods. And we can mitigate against that by restoring wetlands upstream. And one of the easiest ways of doing this is beavers. We actually rewilded a part of our river, Ada, and at huge expense, I'm afraid, to the taxpayer. And it took about 7 years of feasibility studies with the Environment Agency and Reg the digger driver doing, recreating the meanders, the old meanders, doing it much too highly engineered. It took him 2 years to do that. A pair of beavers could have done that in 6 months at no cost whatsoever and much more effectively. So we've got to think about how we can use beavers. So this is our green and pleasant land. I hope it's looking a little bit less green and less pleasant. And this is what it looks like if we can just release our imaginations a bit and get it wilder. We haven't even talked about carbon sequestration. So imagine that last picture. We're just releasing carbon into the atmosphere every time we plough. And this way, we are actually sucking it back down. Huge potential for carbon storage here. In fact, it's probably the most effective tool we have in the fight against climate change. And so what's been happening at Knepp really has taken us and everyone who's been involved in it or observing it completely by surprise. It's been utterly astonishing. Not only have we increased biodiversity, which is the original hope, but we've also, I think, begun to address some of the other pressing questions that we're having to cope with now with the sort of crisis facing our planet. Soil restoration, carbon sequestration, flood mitigation, water purification, air purification, and the impact on human health and well-being. I think that's one of the things that has been most surprising for Charlie and me on this journey from being control freak farmers to the sort of wild side, is the impact it's had on us, ourselves, psychologically. E.O. Wilson calls it biophilia, that innate desire in all of us to connect with living things. And I think that's what you now feel at Knepp. That's what people feel when they come to visit. It's that astonishing sort of sense of completeness when you're surrounded by life that's just humming, buzzing. You couldn't fit any more in there. And when you hear on a sunny evening and you're walking along a water meadow and you hear that lovely tour of a turtle dove in the thickets, that leap of joy you get is just absolutely sort of indescribable. It feels like you belong. That's where you're meant to be. So if there are all these incredible benefits for rewilding, why aren't more people doing it? Well, I think they are actually beginning to look at it seriously. Charlie, who likes to clock up the acreage, added together all the acres that the landowners, land managers and farmers owned who came to visit us last year. It was in excess of 1 million acres. And this year we've easily had another 1 million acres. And already we're seeing rewilding projects kicking off in North Norfolk, the Lowther Estate, 10,000 hectares. So really interesting. People are just beginning to look more openly, I think, at the landscape. And I don't know whether it's climate change rebellion, whether it's extinction rebellion, the plastics revolution. Something is happening that is allowing people to think more openly and perhaps be more ambitious about our landscapes. But it is one thing, I think, to come to Knepp and say, you know, I love what you're doing, and it's another to go back to your own land and do it, to make that leap. And I think one thing that stops people largely, and perhaps it was very kind of difficult for us in the beginning too, is this question of aesthetics. It's that fixed idea we have in our heads of that green and pleasant land. Somehow we're wedded to it. We feel, it makes us feel secure, like things are under control somehow. Or maybe we even just feel nostalgic. Maybe we grew up in that landscape and it's very difficult to see it change, even if we know intellectually that it needs to. So I think really rewilding is as much about learning what it can provide for us and how the system can actually function. It's about questioning ourselves and our own sense of aesthetic. It's about letting go. It's about learning to love the unpredictability of nature again. It's learning to embrace the boom and bust cycles of nature, of animals perhaps in the landscape in places you'd never expected them to be. It's about getting messy, and it's about giving up that sort of corseted Victorian obsession we have with tidying up. So really, I think essentially, rewilding is as much about the big, wide world and the landscapes out there as it is about ourselves, our own mindset. It's about learning how to rewild us. Thank you.
Thank you, Isabella, for an absolutely wonderful, spellbinding lecture. Would you be happy to take some questions?
Yes, very, very happy to take questions if there are any. I'll do my best to answer. Yes, the lady up there.
Thank you very much. The film Rewilding Europe was shown in Oxford a few weeks ago. It's a fantastic film and it features Knepp. But in the discussion which followed, two things came up which surprised me. One of the questions from the floor was, how big does an estate have to be to become rewilded? And the answer given was 1,000 acres. But you mentioned rewilding in the States and in Australia, but I think there's lots of small-scale regenerative agriculture that is moving into rewilding through silver pasture, using hardier traditional breeds, mob grazing, wetland management, all that sort of thing. So that's at one end of the rewilding spectrum as I see it. But what worries me is the other end. I think I've heard you say that you do cull animals at Knepp and you'll intervene if they're in distress. But at the other end, people seem to be interested in reintroducing predators. So one of the another question after the film was, what animals would you like to see reintroduced? And somebody said, oh, well, I'd like to see lynx reintroduced, but, oh, maybe they might take lambs. Well, we've already got the situation where seagulls have been reintroduced in Scotland, and they're taking lambs, and you can see masses of footage on the internet, should you choose to. Can I just say one other thing? That lynx have been discussed as a way of culling deer. But if we, in this country, we think hunting with dogs is barbaric and it's illegal, why on earth do you think some people think it's acceptable for deer to be savaged by lynx?
Okay, well, that was a very long question, if I might say, and so there's quite a lot of layers to your question, and I will just try and answer a bit of it, if I may. I think it's very important not to confuse regenerative farming with rewilding. Rewilding is purely about establishing natural processes, giving nature as much freedom as possible to act naturally. Regenerative farming is about producing food. So you're always going to be highly managing those areas. Yes, they'll be better for biodiversity, but you're not principally allowing nature to function. You're mimicking natural processes in a sense. You're mimicking how nature produces food, but it's a very, very different question. So rewilding needs to be connected so that you can allow these flows, these ebb and flows to happen. You're not doing that when you're producing food year on year. The question about how big your land needs to be, in my book I have, I've stolen, with his permission, a graph from Professor Sir John Lawton. And in it, really, it's very straightforward. He shows a kind of rewilding idea on a scale. So if you're Yellowstone National Park or Chernobyl Exclusion Zone or the Serengeti, you don't need any intervention at all. You're a huge area and you've got a fully naturally performing ecosystem. The smaller you get, the more management you need. So our nature reserves that are 10 hectares or 1 hectare, SSSIs, are typically that small. You need a lot of intervention in order to get that dynamism happening, in order to actually sustain biodiversity. So where we are at Knepp, we are having to intervene because we are having to cull the animals because we don't want to have too much of a big population. I would say actually you can have 300. One of the best examples of a rewilding project is the Kranzvlak in Holland, which is 350 hectares. They've introduced bison and conic ponies, and biodiversity has just gone like that. So I think you can be smaller, but what we're seeing is really important is for areas to connect with each other. So now we have farm clusters, farmers suggesting that they pull up their boundaries between each other and form a project, a number of farmers together to have something really dynamic, really exciting. As for predators, the idea that a predator actually accounts for population control is a little bit of a misconception, I think. If you look at places like Yellowstone and Serengeti, apex predators will only really account for 10% of mortalities. What governs mortalities of herbivore populations is the availability of food. And so in places like Yellowstone or Serengeti, you'll see die-offs, where the populations will rise, they'll eat out all the food, the population collapses, the vegetation begins to regrow, and then the population begins to grow again. We're obviously not going to want to do that in a situation like Knepp. And why would we anyway? Because we can actually get an important income stream for the project and produce incredibly highly nutritious food from it. I think the idea of a lynx is a very good one. I think it would be a stealth predator. It lives principally in woodland, so somewhere like the Kielder Forest would be absolutely perfect for it. Its main prey is roe. If you want to look at the issue of lynx taking lambs, that is mainly from Norway, and you should look at David Hetherington's brilliant book on the lynx. He's the specialist on the lynx. He would explain all of that to you. But they'd be a very low risk predator for us to carve our teeth on.
I think you've covered it quite well. Oops, sorry. It was one that you've already discussed with these issues of apex predators in space. I think you've covered that already quite well.
I mean, I think what Knepp has shown really is I think that you can regenerate biodiversity and kick off ecosystems again without using the apex predator. So the keystone species in our system really are the free-roaming herbivores. That's not to say, that apex predators aren't hugely important. We're very aware that we're missing that at Knepp. Our herbivores are grazing very loosely, very relaxed. They're not living in a landscape of fear. And if they were in the presence of an apex predator, they'd probably bunch up more, they'd move on quicker, and that would have an effect on vegetation. Charlie tried to simulate a wolf the other day by getting on a bicycle and chasing the cattle. And of course, instantly, they bunch up and they behave completely differently. But I think one day it would be wonderful to think that we could have a rewilded landscape where you have corridors connecting truly extensive wilded areas again, and maybe our grandchildren or our great-grandchildren could make the decision about introducing bears and wolves and wolverine.
Thank you for a marvellous talk. There's been quite a lot of talk about planting trees to take out the carbon dioxide. I noticed you said that actually wetlands might be even better. Do you think your advice to the government would be that it should be more diverse than just trees?
Absolutely, and absolutely peatlands and wetlands. I just heard something the other day that a patch of calm grassland has just been ploughed up. All those kind of habitats are fantastic at sequestering carbon, and I have a particular bugbear about planting trees, because what we've seen at Knepp is that nature does it for itself. There's a wonderful old adage in medieval Britain, which is the thorn is the mother of the oak. And once you have that thorny scrub, a jay can plant 6,000 acorns in 4 weeks, one single jay. And so instead of having, our northern forest, which we're going to spend $500 million on, why not allow it to naturally regenerate? One of the things that is going to most threatening our trees at the moment are these diseases coming in. I think I'm right in saying, Keith Kirby, who's here, will probably be able to put me right, but that almost every disease that's come recently has been introduced from a nursery, including cholera, which is our ash dieback disease. Why are we putting spades in the ground, polypropylene tubes, tannalized wooden stakes, plastic ties, all that time, energy, the volunteers, with saplings grown in nurseries, for heaven's sake, which don't have any mycorrhizal associations, and bringing in possibly diseases into our countryside? Why not allow natural regeneration? Those trees will have mycorrhizal fungi associations from the moment they germinate. They'll be much more resilient in the face of climate change and disease. So I think we're actually having a conference with the Woodland Trust next summer at Knepp to try and get more of this idea of regenerative, getting trees back regeneratively rather than just as my old friend Ted Green calls the Woodland Trust the Plantation Trust, and needs to change its tune a bit. Yeah.
Thank you for a fabulous talk. I was fascinated by your Tamworth pigs and the rootling, which is absolutely wonderful, and the regeneration of the wildflowers, some of which haven't been seen for decades. Have those seeds been dormant within that soil literally for decades, or have they been introduced by other birds coming in?
I'm not a botanist, so I can't answer that question. I think I would say both, everything. We know that things like water violet, which we had in one tiny patch, have spread. I imagine, I don't know, but do they spread on the feet of birds? But they've moved to all our water areas now because the water is so pure. I imagine, that they're blowing in, flying in, however way they are distributed. But it's not a landscape. It's not like, if you imagine the sort of wildflower meadows of Romania, Knepp, because almost as soon as any flower pops up, it's grazed. Where you see the wildflowers is protected by the thorny scrub, which is so interesting. And I think that's also teaching us a lot about palynology and what the available pollen would have been like, in order to sediment into bogs. So understanding the sort of process, if you're looking at the picture with these huge herds of roaming animals, sort of changes what amounts of pollen you would expect to see in sedimentation. But I'm not a botanist, I'm afraid. Our ecologist, Penny Green, would be able to answer you instantly.
Yeah. The fumitory is interesting because you said it had never been seen before, but it does occur where there has been human activity in the past. That's
yes. Well, I suppose we're mimicking, aren't we? We're, in a sense, what is a trowel but a miniature pig? What is a plough in a way, but a wild boar? So when we coppice, we're imitating bison and even the elephants of the past. So traditional farming is we're mimicking what the megafauna, the impact they had. Yeah.
Thank you. That was wonderful. What happens if you don't have large animals on the land?
Well, again, it's this question of the sort of sliding scale. So it depends how much land you have. If you can imagine that a Tamworth sow in a wet winter can plough up 50 acres, then you kind of have an idea of, if I have 50 acres, I certainly can't have a Tamworth sow, let alone all year round. So I think there could be a possibility of bringing in, borrowing a sow from somebody for a few weeks to, at least at the beginning, to kickstart, open things up, get dynamism going. Borrowing some grazers. And ultimately, if you're not going to do that, or you're worried perhaps about biosecurity, because that's obviously an issue, then you have to think like a wild boar, think like a beaver. So Charlie recently had a meeting with the man who's in charge of all our railways, the embankments on our railways. And they would suddenly thought, well, this is amazing, that's 10,000 miles of connectivity. How do we manage that as a landscape? And so what they're doing is they're designing how those embankments are managed as if they were beavers. So coppicing it, not allowing the trees to grow really tall when they threaten falling on the track, but actually keeping them coppiced in rotation. And that will be hugely beneficial for biodiversity. We are, and Charlie and Charlie's going to be involved in this one. The next book is going to be the Wilding Handbook, where we hope to be answering those questions. So it's going to be a practical guide for rewilding big and small.
We've got time for just one last question.
We'll just keep it to one. I'd like to ask more, but I'll keep it at one. So I'm interested in the practicalities of how you go about setting something like this up, but really from a funding perspective. So you said that you've had people who've got maybe 1 million hectares of land that visited Knepp over the last year or so, collectively, yes. And from that, it sounds like you've had one group set up a fairly large rewilding project. Quite a few. Okay, yeah, I said no, that's totally fine. So I suppose what I was interested in, early in this talk, you said about getting your HLS funding took, I think it was 7 years, did you say? And yeah, and I suppose if people are running a business, how can they deal with that level of a shortfall for 7 years? And is it easier to get that funding through the stewardship schemes now than it was when you did it?
I think the funding is a huge question, and it has to make sense economically. And for us, we were able to get the funding with HLS, and we still get basic payment, which we know is going to go, and quite rightly too. You shouldn't be paid just for owning land. But what we hope, dare I even mention the word, the future governments will in the agricultural bill at the moment, there is going to be a sort of funding body called the Environmental Land Management Scheme, which will replace the agri-environment schemes currently underway from Europe. And that is going to reward land managers for providing these ecosystem services that I was talking about. So if you're restoring your soil, you're sequestering carbon, you're purifying the water, which of course knock-on effects on our bills, on our water bills, if we're not having to pay for that water to be cleaned because it's got nitrates and soil in it. If you're providing all these ecosystem services, then the plan is that you will get paid. So that I hope will be the carrot, as it were, to get other land managers and farmers to enter this sort of scheme. Particularly if they're on marginal land and they're not going to be going into regenerative farming. The stick, which I'm equally pleased to hear the policymakers and civil servants talking about, is the polluter pays. So, for the first time, I think they're looking seriously at calling farmers to account for what they do to the soil and to water and to the air. And so that will also be, I think, a big game changer in the sort of whole farming mindset going forward. But for us, we feel uncomfortable relying on subsidies because we know that governments come and go and people change subsidies, and it makes you in a very vulnerable position if you're reliant on them. We now have an income stream from our meat, which we hope to be growing as we start doing charcuterie and selling direct to the public. We also have an ecotourism business, and I think that's just the tip of the iceberg. I think there's so much interest out there from ecotourism that it really could be replicated in all sorts of places around the country. But that now is also a big income stream for us. And also all the agricultural buildings that were just costing us to keep the roof on before, we're now converting into light industrial use, office space. And now those buildings, although we don't employ the people in them, but the companies that rent from us employ 200 people. So that's 200 jobs back in the rural environment. So I think it is something that can be replicated even on smaller scales elsewhere in the country.
There are lots more questions people want to put, but I'm afraid we have to stop now. Perhaps we'll be lucky enough to grab Isabella during the reception afterwards. But thank you enormously for an absolutely fabulous talk. And you certainly left me feeling with a renewed sense of hope. Just the extraordinary regeneration that you and your husband have been able to achieve. So thank you very much indeed.
Pleasure, absolutely.